The stranger in the shadows. The smoky haze of twilight settled over the small southern town, where Elliot's taproom sat like an unassuming sentinel by the side of Highway 74. Inside, the bar exuded a blend of warmth and wear, a haven for weary travelers and locals alike. The jukebox hummed with an old Willie Nelson tune, filling the space with a bittersweet melody. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the wooden floors, highlighting the faded walls and chipped tabletops. Terrence Lawson pulled his weathered pickup truck into the gravel lot, his mind restless despite the stillness of the evening. The truck's engine sputtered before falling silent, mirroring the exhaustion Terrence felt deep in his bones. He had returned home just a week ago after his fourth deployment overseas, and the days since had been a blur of uneasy reunions and well-meaning questions he wasn't ready to answer. Tonight, he craved solitude, a place to sit quietly and think without the weight of expectations pressing down on him. Dressed in plain jeans and a fitted black t-shirt, Terrence looked every bit the part of a man seeking anonymity. His military dog tags lay tucked beneath the fabric, out of sight, but never far from his heart. He reached into the truck bed to grab a small duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder before heading toward the bar. The neon open sign buzzed faintly, its glow a beacon against the encroaching darkness. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and for a brief moment, all eyes turned toward him. Terrence ignored the curious stares and stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The taproom was sparsely populated. A few regulars leaned against the bar nursing beers, a couple played pool in the corner, and a lone trucker occupied a booth near the back. No one seemed particularly threatening, but Terrence felt the subtle shift in energy as he walked across the room. He chose a table near the wall, away from prying eyes, but with a clear view of the exit. Old habits died hard. After ordering a glass of water and a plate of fries from the bartender, he settled into his seat, his gaze drifting across the room. Despite the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, an undercurrent of tension lingered, as if the bar itself held its breath. For a while, Terrence allowed himself to relax. The fries arrived, crisp and golden, and he ate them slowly, savoring the simplicity of the moment. His thoughts wandered to his family, his mother's warm embrace, his father's gruff words of pride disguised as advice, and the gleeful chatter of his young niece who had grown so much in his absence. The memories brought a faint smile to his face, a rare moment of peace in the tumult of his mind. The bar's door slammed open with a resounding bang, shattering the fragile tranquility. Terrence's hand instinctively tensed around his glass as a group of 5 men strode in, their presence commanding attention like a pack of wolves entering foreign territory. They were bikers, their leather jackets emblazoned with patches and slogans. Their boots clonked heavily against the wooden floor, and their voices carried above the murmur of the room. The leader of the group, a stocky man with a graying beard and a perpetual scowl, led the charge to the bar. His name, as Terrence would later learn, was Hank. Hank barked orders to the bartender, slapping cash onto the counter with an air of entitlement. His laughter was loud and sharp, cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. The other men followed suit, their antics drawing uneasy glances from the other patrons. Terrence kept his head down, focusing on his fries as the group settled in. But he felt their presence like a storm cloud looming overhead. Years of training had honed his instincts, and tonight they whispered of trouble brewing. It didn't take long for Hank to notice him. "What do we have here?" Hank's gravelly voice cut through the din, loud enough to draw attention. His beady eyes locked onto Terrence with a predatory gleam. "You lost, stranger." Terrence didn't respond immediately, taking a deliberate sip of water before looking up. "Nope, just enjoying a quiet evening." Hank's lips twisted into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. "Quiet, huh? Funny. You don't look like the quiet type. Looks to me like you're hiding something." One of Hank's companions chuckled, a high-pitched, unpleasant sound that grated on the ears. "Maybe he's scared of us, Hank." Sitting there all alone, looking like he don't belong. The others joined in the laughter, their amusement echoing around the room. Terence remained calm, his face a mask of indifference. He had dealt with bullies before, men who mistook kindness for weakness, who thrived on intimidation. He wasn't about to let them rattle him. "Just here for the fries," he said evenly, gesturing to his half-empty plate. "Not looking for any trouble." "Trouble," Hank repeated, feigning surprise. "We're not trouble. Just a bunch of old-timers trying to enjoy a drink. Ain't that right, boys?" The group erupted in agreement, their voices a cacophony of mock sincerity. Hank leaned against the bar, his gaze never leaving Terence. "But you, on the other hand, you look like trouble to me. Wearing that shirt all tight like you're trying to show off. What are you, some kind of tough guy?" Terence sighed inwardly, the weight of the situation settling over him like a heavy cloak. He could feel the attention of the other patrons, their silent judgment hanging in the air. Some watched with curiosity, others with caution, but no one intervened. "I'm just a guy trying to eat his fries in peace," Terence replied, his tone calm but firm. "So why don't you leave me to it?" The challenge in his voice was subtle, but it was enough to stoke Hank's ego. The biker pushed off the bar and took a step closer, his grin widening as he loomed over Terence's table. "Oh, I like this one," Hank said, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "Got a bit of fight in him. But I don't think you understand how things work around here. This is our place. We don't take kindly to strangers coming in and acting like they own the joint." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Terence set his glass down and slowly rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, and his expression unreadable. "I don't want any trouble," Terence said, his voice steady. "But if you're looking for a fight, I can promise you won't like the outcome." Hank's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Is that so?" he sneered. "Well, why don't you show me what you've got, tough guy?" The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men squared off. Terence's heart pounded in his chest, but his training kept him focused. He didn't want this fight, but he wouldn't shy away from it either. What happened next would change the course of the evening, and Terence's life. Forever. The line in the sand. The bar fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Even the jukebox seemed to falter, its melody fading into the background as all eyes turned toward the brewing confrontation. Terence stood tall, his steady gaze locked on Hank. Years of discipline coursed through him like a steady current, calming his breathing and sharpening his senses. This wasn't a battlefield, but it felt just as tense. Hank's smirk returned, a thin veneer of confidence masking the simmering anger in his eyes. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he sneered, taking another step closer. His voice dripped with condescension. "Just because you stand tall doesn't mean you can take me, boy." Terence's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "I'm not here to prove anything to you. Walk away while you still can." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of authority, a tone only a man who had seen the worst of humanity could wield. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, a final chance for Hank to back down before the situation escalated. But Hank didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it with exaggerated casualness. He took a long drag, the glow of the cherry casting shadows across his face. "You've got a mouth on you, tough guy," he said, exhaling smoke in a slow, deliberate stream. "But I don't take orders from strangers, especially ones who don't know their place." The group of bikers shifted uneasily behind Hank, their bravado waning as the tension in the room thickened. Some of them glanced at each other, silently questioning whether this confrontation was worth it. But none dared to speak against their leader. From the corner of his eye, Terence noticed the bartender subtly moving toward the phone mounted on the wall. The older man's hand hovered near the receiver, ready to call for help if things got out of hand. Terence appreciated the gesture, but he didn't want it to come to that. "I don't want trouble," Terence said again, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm not going to stand here and let you push me around." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Hank seemed to hesitate. Perhaps he recognized the quiet confidence in Terence's stance, the way his hands remained relaxed at his sides, ready but not threatening. Or perhaps he realized that this wasn't a fight he could win easily. But Hank's pride wouldn't let him back down. He took one last drag from his cigarette before flicking it to the floor and grinding it under his boot. "Well then," he said, his voice low and menacing, "let's see if you can back up that talk." Without warning, Hank lunged forward, his arm swinging wide in a sloppy attempt to grab Terence by the collar. It was a move born of brute force, not skill, and it left Hank exposed. Terence reacted instinctively, his years of training kicking in like second nature. With a swift, calculated motion, Terence sidestepped the attack, his hand darting out to grab Hank's wrist. In a single fluid movement, he twisted the arm behind Hank's back and pushed him forward, forcing the biker to stumble and slam against the edge of the table. The suddenness of the maneuver left the entire bar in stunned silence. Hank let out a grunt of pain, his free hand gripping the table for support as Terence leaned in, his voice low but commanding. "I told you to back off. Now you're going to listen." The other bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they watched their leader pinned against the table. One of them, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, took a hesitant step forward. "Hey, man," he stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Let him go. He didn't mean nothing by it." Terence's gaze flicked to the man, his expression unreadable. If he didn't mean it, he shouldn't have started it. Hank struggled against Terence's grip, his face red with a mix of pain and humiliation. "You're gonna regret this," he growled through gritted teeth. "You don't know who you're messing with." "I know exactly who I'm messing with," Terence replied evenly. "And I'm giving you a chance to walk away. Don't make me regret it." The bartender finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Maybe it's time for everyone to calm down," he said, his tone cautious but firm. "This is a bar, not a boxing ring. If you can't keep it civil, you can take it outside." The other patrons murmured their agreement, their voices hesitant but growing bolder. It was clear that while they didn't want to get involved, they also didn't want the situation to escalate further. Terence released Hank with a controlled shove, stepping back to give the man room to recover. Hank staggered slightly but quickly straightened, his hand massaging his shoulder as he glared at Terence. "You think this is over?" Hank spat, his voice venomous. "I'm not done with you." Terence didn't flinch. "It's over if you let it be. Your call." For a moment, it seemed like Hank might lunge again, his fists clenching at his sides. But the murmurs of the crowd, the bartender's watchful gaze, and the unwavering composure of the man before him gave him pause. Finally, with a frustrated growl, Hank turned and stormed toward the door, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. The other bikers followed, casting wary glances at Terence as they went. As the door slammed shut behind them, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. The bartender let out a long sigh, his hand dropping from the phone. "You okay?" he asked, his gaze settling on Terence. "I'm fine," Terence replied, his tone calm but weary. He reached for his glass of water, taking a long sip to steady himself. The patrons began to return to their conversations, though their glances lingered on Terence with a mix of curiosity and quiet respect. The moment had passed, but its impact remained. Terence sat back down, his plate of fries now cold and unappetizing. He didn't regret standing his ground, but the encounter had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He hadn't come here to prove himself or make a scene. He'd come for peace, and once again, the world had reminded him how elusive that could be. As he stared into his glass, the faint sound of motorcycles revving outside reached his ears. He knew this wasn't the last he'd see of Hank and his crew. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet, the calm before the storm he knew was brewing. Shadows of the past. The rumble of motorcycles echoed faintly in the distance as Terence sat in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. The patrons of Elliot's taproom had resumed their conversations, though their voices were more subdued, their eyes still flicking toward him occasionally. Terence ignored the stares, focusing instead on the swirl of thoughts and memories dredged up by the evening's events. His hands rested on the table, steady and unshaken despite the tension that had gripped the room moments earlier. Years of service had taught him how to remain composed under pressure, but tonight's encounter had stirred something deeper. It wasn't just about Hank's bravado or the thinly veiled hostility in his words. It was the reminder of the battles Terence had fought long before he'd ever set foot on foreign soil. He thought back to his childhood, growing up in a small southern town not unlike this one. His father had been a proud but stern man, a veteran of the Gulf War who believed in discipline and hard work. From an early age, Terence had learned the value of resilience, of standing tall in the face of adversity. But he'd also learned that not all battles were fought with fists or weapons. Some were fought with quiet dignity, with the refusal to bow under the weight of prejudice and ignorance. Terence's thoughts were interrupted by the approach of the bartender, a wiry man in his 50s with graying hair and a tired smile. He carried a fresh glass of water and set it down in front of Terence with a nod. "On the house," he said, his voice low but warm, "for keeping things from getting too out of hand." "Thanks," Terence replied, lifting the glass in a small gesture of appreciation. He took a sip, letting the cool liquid wash away the dryness in his throat. The bartender lingered, leaning against the edge of the table. "You handled yourself well back there," he said, his eyes studying Terence with quiet curiosity. "Not many people could have kept their cool like that." "Old habits," Terence said with a faint smile. "Comes with the territory." The bartender nodded knowingly. "Military." "Yeah, thought so," the bartender said, his gaze flicking to the duffel bag by Terence's feet. "Hank and his boys. Well, they're not as tough as they like to think. Just loud. Most folks around here steer clear of him." "Smart move," Terence said. "But sometimes steering clear isn't an option." The bartender's lips twitched in a wry smile. "Ain't that the truth? Name's Jack, by the way." "Terence." Jack extended a hand, and Terence shook it firmly. "Well, Terence, let me know if they give you any more trouble. I'll make sure you're not drinking alone." Terence nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing full well that Jack's offer wouldn't stop men like Hank. Bullies didn't back down easily, and tonight's confrontation had likely bruised Hank's ego enough to guarantee a follow-up. The thought didn't unsettle Terence. It simply reminded him to stay vigilant. As Jack returned to the bar, Terence leaned back in his seat and let his eyes wander the room. The pool players had resumed their game, the crack of the cue ball punctuating their quiet conversation. A couple at a nearby table laughed softly, their heads close together. The trucker in the corner scribbled in a battered notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a scene of normalcy, a slice of life that felt distant and unfamiliar to Terence. He'd spent so many years in environments where every moment was charged with tension, where every sound or movement could signal danger. Even now, in the relative safety of this small-town bar, his instincts remained sharp, his mind alert to the slightest shifts in his surroundings. The sound of footsteps approaching broke his reverie. He turned to see a young woman standing hesitantly near his table, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She wore a faded denim jacket and jeans, her expression a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Terence hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure." She slid into the seat, her movements quick but unhurried. For a moment, she said nothing, her hands fiddling with the edge of her jacket as she studied him. Finally, she spoke. "I saw what happened earlier," she said, her voice soft but steady. "With those bikers." Terence raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And?" The woman shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And I wanted to say thanks for not letting them get away with their crap." Terence leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. Didn't do it for thanks. Just didn't feel like getting pushed around. I know, she said quickly, her cheeks flushing slightly. But still, it was impressive, the way you handled yourself. Terence gave a faint nod, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to compliments, especially from strangers. Appreciate it, he said finally. The woman extended a hand, her smile widening. I'm Rachel. Terence. They shook hands briefly, and Rachel settled back into her seat, her curiosity evident. So, are you just passing through, or are you local? Neither, Terence said. Came back home after deployment. Needed some quiet. Rachel's expression softened. Military, huh? That explains a lot. Explains what? The way you carry yourself, she said, gesturing vaguely. Like you're ready for anything. It's different. Terence chuckled softly, the sound low and dry. Different isn't always a good thing. Rachel tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. Depends on who you ask. The conversation was interrupted by the distant roar of motorcycle engines. Terence's body tensed instinctively, his eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder. Rachel noticed the change in his demeanor and glanced toward the door, her expression shifting to concern. Think they're coming back? She asked, her voice hushed. Probably, Terence said, his tone grim. Guys like that don't take well to being shown up. Rachel bit her lip, her fingers drumming nervously against the table. Should we do something? Call the cops? Terence shook his head. Not yet. Let's see how this plays out. The engines grew louder until they seemed to reverberate through the walls. Moments later, the doors swung open and Hank strode in, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Behind him, the rest of the bikers filed in, their expressions ranging from uneasy to outright hostile. The bar fell silent once again, the atmosphere thick with tension. Terence rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He met Hank's glare with an unflinching gaze, his posture steady and unyielding. Hank stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You thought you could make a fool out of me, he growled, his voice low and venomous. You don't know who you're dealing with. I think I do, Terence replied calmly, and I'm not impressed. The words landed like a slap, and Hank's face twisted with rage. The bikers behind him shifted nervously, their earlier confidence wavering. The bar's patrons watched in silence, their expressions a mix of fear and anticipation. This time, Terence knew there would be no simple resolution. Hank was here to prove a point, and Terence was prepared to stand his ground. As the room braced for what was to come, Terence felt the familiar calm of focus settle over him. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The breaking point. The room seemed frozen in time, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The faint hum of the jukebox was the only sound, its melody an almost mocking contrast to the volatile energy crackling in the air. Terence stood his ground, his broad frame relaxed, but his eyes razor-sharp, locked on Hank. Across the room, Rachel sat stiffly at the table, her knuckles white as they gripped the edge. Hank took another step forward, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. His expression was a twisted mask of anger and bruised pride, his fists clenching and unclenching as he squared up to Terence. The other bikers trailed behind him like a pack of hesitant wolves, their earlier bravado now tinged with unease. You think you're a big man, huh? Hank sneered, his voice loud enough to echo through the bar. Think you can walk into my town, my bar, and make me look like a damn fool? Terence tilted his head slightly, his face calm but unreadable. I didn't come here to make anyone look like anything. You chose this, Hank. The use of his name gave Hank pause, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but it was quickly swallowed by his ego. Don't you talk to me like you know me, he growled, pointing an accusing finger at Terence. You don't know a damn thing about me. I know enough, Terence replied evenly, his voice steady but laced with quiet authority. "I know you're so caught up in your own pride that you can't see when it's time to walk away." The room collectively held its breath as Hank's face darkened, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. For a moment, it seemed like he might charge at Terence right then and there, his pride demanding retribution. But one of his crew, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hank," the man said quietly, glancing around the room, "maybe we should just go. This ain't worth it." Hank shrugged the hand off violently, turning to glare at the man. "Shut up, Bill. I don't need you telling me what's worth it." Bill flinched but didn't respond, his shoulders hunching as he backed away. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their uncertainty growing with each passing second. It was clear that Hank was losing control, his rage blinding him to the shifting dynamics of the situation. "Listen," Terence said, his tone measured. "We can end this right here. Nobody gets hurt, nobody gets arrested. All you have to do is walk out that door." Hank let out a harsh laugh, his voice dripping with scorn. "Walk out? You think I'm just gonna walk out and let you humiliate me again? No, tough guy. That's not how this ends." Before anyone could react, Hank lunged forward, his fist swinging in a wild arc aimed at Terence's jaw. But Terence was ready. He sidestepped the punch with practiced precision, his movements smooth and controlled. As Hank stumbled past him, off balance from the failed attack, Terence pivoted and delivered a firm shove to his back, sending the larger man crashing into a nearby table. The sound of splintering wood filled the room as the table collapsed under Hank's weight, spilling drinks and scattering chairs. Gasps erupted from the patrons, and a couple of them bolted for the door, eager to avoid being caught in the chaos. The bikers hesitated, their uncertainty giving way to anger as they moved to surround Terence. Rachel's voice cut through the commotion, sharp and urgent. "Stop it, all of you." Her plea hung in the air, but it did little to deter the bikers. Terence's eyes flicked briefly to her before returning to the men circling him. He could see the tension in their movements, the way their hands hovered near their belts or fists clenched at their sides. They were unsure, hesitant. None of them wanted to be the first to make a move. "You don't want to do this," Terence said, his voice calm but firm. "Think about it. What's this going to prove? That you can jump one guy? That you can throw your weight around and intimidate people? That's not strength. That's weakness." One of the bikers, a younger man with a shaved head, bristled at the words. "You think you're better than us," he snapped, taking a step forward. "You don't know anything about us." "I don't have to know you to see what's happening here," Terence replied, his gaze steady. "You're following a man who's letting his pride drag him. And all of you, down with him. Walk away. You'll thank yourself later." The shaved-headed man hesitated, his resolve wavering under the weight of Terence's words. But before he could make a decision, Hank rose unsteadily from the wreckage of the table, his face red with fury. "Don't just stand there," he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at Terence. "Get him." The command seemed to snap the bikers out of their indecision. Two of them lunged forward simultaneously, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Terence stepped back, dodging the first man's swing and grabbing the second by the wrist. Using the man's momentum against him, Terence twisted his arm and sent him sprawling to the floor with a swift sweep of his leg. The first man tried again, this time aiming a wild punch at Terence's midsection. But Terence sidestepped easily, catching the man's arm and delivering a sharp elbow to his ribs. The man doubled over with a pained grunt, clutching his side as he stumbled away. The remaining bikers froze, their confidence shattered by how effortlessly Terence had dispatched their friends. Even Hank seemed momentarily stunned, his fury giving way to a flicker of doubt. "Enough," Terence said, his voice ringing out like a command. "This ends now." For a moment, no one moved. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado replaced by a mixture of fear and respect. Finally, Bill, the wiry man who had tried to reason with Hank earlier, stepped forward. "He's right," Bill said, his voice quiet but steady. "This has gone too far, Hank. Let's go." Hank turned to glare at him, his chest heaving with labored breaths. "You're siding with him." "I'm siding with common sense," Bill replied, meeting Hank's gaze without flinching. "You're out of control, man. It's not worth it." The other bikers murmured their agreement, their voices low but firm. One by one, they began to step back, distancing themselves from Hank. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by an uneasy silence. Hank's shoulders slumped as he realized he was alone, his allies abandoning him in the face of Terrence's quiet strength. With a final, venomous glare at Terrence, he spat on the floor and stormed out of the bar, slamming the door behind him. The other bikers followed reluctantly, their footsteps heavy with shame. As the door swung shut, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Jack, the bartender, emerged from behind the counter, his expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "You all right?" he asked Terrence. "I'm fine," Terrence replied, his voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Rachel approached hesitantly, her eyes wide with concern. "That was intense," she said. "Are you sure you're okay?" Terrence offered a faint smile. "I've been through worse." The bar gradually returned to normal, though the events of the evening lingered in the air. As Terrence sat back down, his mind turned to what Hank had said, to the anger and bitterness that had fueled the confrontation. He knew this wasn't the end of it. Men like Hank didn't let things go easily. But for now, Terrence allowed himself a moment of quiet, the storm having passed, for the time being. The fire within. The night outside Elliot's taproom was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the turbulence that had unfolded within its walls. Terrence stepped out into the gravel parking lot, his boots crunching softly against the ground. The distant hum of the highway was the only sound, a reminder of how small and isolated this corner of the world truly was. Despite the tension of the evening, Terrence felt calm. The confrontation had been inevitable, a collision of pride and principles that neither he nor Hank could have avoided. But now that it was over, he was left with the weight of its implications. Men like Hank didn't just walk away from a bruised ego. There would be repercussions. Of that, Terrence was certain. He leaned against his pickup truck, staring up at the night sky. The stars were faint but visible, their quiet presence a stark reminder of how vast the universe was. Terrence had seen those same stars from faraway deserts and foreign jungles, their constancy a comfort during the chaos of deployment. Now, back home, they seemed distant, as if they belonged to a world he no longer recognized. The sound of a door creaking open pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Rachel stepping out of the bar, her denim jacket pulled tightly around her as she scanned the lot. When her eyes met his, she hesitated for a moment before walking over. "You all right?" she asked, her voice soft. Terrence nodded. "Yeah, just needed some air." Rachel stood beside him, her hands stuffed into her pockets as she gazed up at the sky. For a moment, they said nothing, the silence between them comfortable but charged with unspoken questions. Finally, she broke the stillness. "You handled yourself well in there," she said. "Not many people would have stayed as calm as you did." "Comes with the territory," Terrence replied, his tone even. "Military territory?" she asked, glancing at him. Terrence nodded. "Yeah." Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I figured as much. My brother's a Marine. I've seen that look before." "What look?" "The one that says you've seen things most people can't imagine." Terrence didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It changes you," he said finally. "Makes you see the world differently." Rachel nodded, her understanding evident. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," Terrence admitted, "but not the way people think. I don't miss the danger or the chaos. I miss the sense of purpose, the clarity." Rachel tilted her head, her eyes searching his face. And now? Now I'm just trying to figure out where I fit, Terrence said, his voice tinged with a quiet vulnerability. It's not as easy as coming home and picking up where you left off. Rachel nodded again, her gaze thoughtful. Maybe you're not supposed to fit back into the same place, she said. Maybe you're meant to carve out a new one. Her word hung in the air, their meaning resonating deeply with Terrence. Before he could respond, the faint sound of engines reached their ears, growing louder with each passing second. Terrence straightened, his body tensing instinctively as he turned toward the road. 3 motorcycles emerged from the darkness, their headlights cutting through the night as they pulled into the parking lot. The roar of their engines shattered the quiet, the sound reverberating off the surrounding buildings. Terrence recognized the riders immediately, Hank and 2 of his crew, their silhouettes unmistakable. Rachel stiffened beside him, her eyes wide with alarm. "They're back," she whispered. "I figured they would be," Terrence said calmly, his gaze never leaving the approaching bikers. He turned to Rachel, his tone firm but reassuring. "Go back inside. Let Jack know what's happening." Rachel hesitated, her concern evident. "What about you?" "I'll be fine," Terrence said, his voice steady. "Go." Reluctantly, Rachel turned and hurried back into the bar, the door closing softly behind her. Terrence remained where he was, his stance relaxed but ready as the bikers dismounted and approached him. Hank led the way, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and smug satisfaction. "Couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Hank said, his voice low and menacing. "Had to humiliate me in front of everyone." "You did that to yourself," Terrence replied evenly. "You're the one who came looking for trouble." Hank took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get it, do you? This is my town, my turf. You don't get to come in here and make me look like a fool." "I'm not here to fight you, Hank," Terrence said, his tone calm but firm. "But if you force my hand, I won't back down." Hank's lips curled into a sneer. Big words for someone who's outnumbered. Terrence's gaze flicked to the 2 bikers flanking Hank, their postures tense but hesitant. He could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other as if questioning their leader's judgment. It was a dynamic he recognized, a pack divided, their loyalty wavering. "You don't have to do this," Terrence said, addressing the 2 men. "You can walk away. Nobody has to get hurt." One of the bikers, a tall, wiry man with a nervous twitch, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe he's right, Hank," he said quietly. "Maybe we should just let it go." Hank rounded on him, his face contorted with fury. "Shut up, Bill. You don't get to tell me what to do." Bill flinched but didn't back down, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. "I'm just saying, maybe this isn't worth it." The second biker, a stocky man with a shaved head, nodded reluctantly. "He's got a point, Hank. This guy's not backing down, and we're not exactly on solid ground here." Hank's face darkened, his anger boiling over. "Cowards, the both of you. Fine. I'll handle this myself." Before anyone could react, Hank lunged at Terrence, his movements wild and uncoordinated. Terrence sidestepped easily, grabbing Hank's arm and twisting it behind his back in one swift motion. Hank let out a cry of pain as Terrence forced him to the ground, his knee pressing firmly against Hank's back. "Enough," Terrence said, his voice low but commanding. "This ends here." The other 2 bikers stood frozen, their uncertainty giving way to resignation. Bill stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "All right, man. You made your point. Let him go." Terrence released Hank and stepped back, his movements measured. Hank scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation as he glared at Terrence. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "Maybe," Terrence said calmly. "But not tonight." Hank turned and stalked back to his motorcycle, his posture rigid with barely contained fury. The other 2 bikers followed, their expressions subdued. As the engines roared to life, and the trio sped off into the night, Terrence exhaled slowly, his body relaxing for the first time in hours. The door to the bar creaked open, and Rachel stepped out cautiously, her eyes scanning the lot. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I'm fine," Terence replied, his tone steady. He turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks for having my back." Rachel returned the smile, her relief evident. "Any time." As the night settled into quiet once more, Terence knew that this wasn't the end of the story. Hank's bruised pride would ensure that the tension lingered, but for now, Terence allowed himself a moment of peace. He had faced the fire and walked away unscathed, both a victory and a reminder of the battles that still lay ahead. Redemption in the dawn. The early morning air carried a crisp chill as the first light of dawn painted the horizon in soft hues of gold and pink. Terence stood on the front porch of his modest home, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the previous evening like a looping reel. The confrontation with Hank, the tension among the bikers, and Rachel's quiet resilience all churned in his thoughts. The gravel driveway crunched under the weight of approaching tires, pulling him from his reverie. The lone motorcycle came into view, its engine subdued compared to the aggressive roar of the night before. Terence's posture stiffened slightly as the rider dismounted and removed his helmet, revealing Bill, the wiry biker who had attempted to reason with Hank. Bill approached cautiously, his leather jacket hanging loosely on his thin frame. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "Morning," he said, his voice tentative. "Morning," Terence replied, his tone neutral. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Bill. "What brings you here?" Bill shuffled awkwardly, his boots scuffing against the gravel. "Look, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now," he began, "but I wanted to come by. And I don't know, make things right." Terence raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Is that so?" "Yeah." Bill hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. "Last night, it got way out of hand. Hank's got this way of dragging people down with him, you know. But that doesn't excuse what we did. I should have spoken up sooner, should have done more to stop it." Terence leaned against the porch railing, studying Bill carefully. There was no hostility in the man's posture, only guilt and a tentative hope for understanding. "And what made you decide to come here?" Terence asked. "Why not just walk away and leave it at that?" Bill scratched the back of his neck, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Because you didn't deserve any of that," he said finally. "You stood your ground without losing your temper. You could have made things a lot worse for us, but you didn't. That's not something I've seen much of, especially from someone who had every reason to hit back." The sincerity in Bill's voice gave Terence pause. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the words sink in. Then he gestured to the steps. "You want some coffee?" Bill blinked, clearly surprised, but nodded. "Sure. That'd be nice." Terence disappeared into the house for a moment, returning with a second mug. He handed it to Bill, who accepted it gratefully and perched on the bottom step. The two men sat in silence for a while, the quiet of the morning settling around them like a blanket. "I never wanted trouble," Terence said eventually, his voice calm but firm. "But I've seen enough of it to know when it's coming. Last night wasn't about me. It was about Hank trying to prove something. Trying to hold on to something he's already lost." Bill nodded, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. "Hank's been that way ever since his accident. Used to be the toughest guy around, but after he wrecked his bike a couple years ago, he's never been the same. He doesn't want anyone to see it though, so he pushes harder, gets louder. It's like he thinks if he yells enough, no one will notice he's struggling." "Pride's a dangerous thing," Terence said quietly. "It blinds you to what's really important." Bill glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through some stuff, haven't you?" Terence gave a small, humorless chuckle. "You could say that. 4 deployments overseas, seen more than my share of chaos. But the hardest part isn't what happens over there. It's coming back here and trying to figure out how to live with it. Bill nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I think Hank's fighting his own war, even if it's just in his head. Doesn't make what he did right, though. No, it doesn't, Terence agreed. But it does explain it. They lapsed into silence again, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. The sun had risen higher now, casting a warm glow across the yard. Birds chirped in the trees, their cheerful song a sharp contrast to the somber tone of the morning. Finally, Bill spoke again. I don't know if it matters, but I'm sorry. For everything. It matters, Terence said, his tone soft but firm. Acknowledging the wrong is the first step toward making it right. Bill nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I'll talk to the others. Try to get them to see things differently. Hank, well, he's a tougher nut to crack, but maybe one day he'll come around. That's up to him, Terence said. You can't force someone to change. They have to want it for themselves. Bill drained the last of his coffee and stood, brushing off his jeans. I should get going. Thanks for the coffee, and for not holding last night against me. Terence stood as well, offering a small nod. We all make mistakes, Bill. It's what we do after that defines us. Bill gave him a faint smile, the first genuine one Terence had seen from him. Take care, Terence. You too. As Bill mounted his motorcycle and rode off, Terence watched him go, his thoughts swirling. The previous night's events had left a mark, not just on the people involved, but on the fabric of the small town itself. Change was slow, but it was possible. And sometimes, all it took was one person willing to take the first step. Terence turned and headed back inside, his mind already shifting to the day ahead. There was work to be done, both within and without. The world wasn't perfect, but it was worth fighting for, one quiet act of resilience at a time. A new chapter. As Terence closed the door behind him, the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. He set his empty mug on the counter and leaned against it, his thoughts still on Bill's visit. It wasn't often that someone came back to own their mistakes, especially when it involved swallowing their pride. That alone gave Terence a sliver of hope that maybe things could change. He walked into the living room, where his duffel bag sat in a corner, half-packed with remnants of his deployment. Slowly, he crouched beside it, running his fingers over the worn canvas. Inside were fragments of his past, photographs, patches, and a folded uniform that still carried the scent of desert air. Each item told a story, a piece of the man he had become. He pulled out a small notebook, its cover frayed from years of wear. Opening it, he flipped through the pages filled with his own handwriting. Notes, reflections, and letters he had written to himself when the noise of war grew too loud. One passage stood out, written during his last deployment. Strength isn't about winning every fight. It's about knowing when to stand, when to speak, and when to listen. It's about walking away with dignity when others cling to pride. The words felt heavier now, imbued with the weight of last night's events. Terence closed the notebook and set it aside, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't done fighting, not in the literal sense, but in the quiet battles that mattered most. Battles for understanding, for connection, for the hope that people could be better than their worst moments. The sound of tires crunching on gravel jolted him from his thoughts. Another visitor. Terence rose and moved to the window, peering out. A familiar red sedan pulled into the driveway, and a wave of surprise washed over him as Rachel stepped out, a determined look on her face. He opened the door just as she reached the porch, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her jacket. "You're persistent," he said with a faint smile. Rachel shrugged, her expression softening. "Well, I figured you might want some company after everything. Besides," she held up a thermos, "I brought coffee. And it's better than the stuff Jack brews." Terence chuckled, stepping aside to let her in. "That's not a high bar, but I'll take it." They settled in the living room, the thermos between them on the coffee table. Rachel poured 2 cups, the aroma filling the space. For a while, they sipped in comfortable silence, the tension of the previous night replaced by a sense of cautious camaraderie. "So," Rachel said finally, setting her cup down, "what's next for you?" Terence leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. "Not sure yet. Coming home hasn't been as easy as I thought it would be. Feels like I'm still figuring out where I belong." Rachel nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I think a lot of people feel that way, even without the experiences you've had. But you've got something most people don't." "What's that?" Terence asked, raising an eyebrow. "Perspective," Rachel said simply. "You've seen the worst of what people can do, but you've also shown what it means to stand for something better. That's rare, Terence. And it matters." Her words hit deeper than he expected, stirring something in his chest. He didn't reply immediately, letting the sentiment sink in. "I've been thinking about getting involved," he said after a moment. "Maybe working with other veterans, helping them transition back. It's not just about the jobs or the paperwork. It's about finding purpose again." Rachel's face lit up, her smile genuine. "That sounds perfect for you. You've got the kind of strength people need to see." Terence gave a small nod, a sense of clarity settling over him. "Yeah, maybe it's time I stop just getting by and start giving back." Their conversation meandered after that, touching on lighter topics: the town, Rachel's family, and Terence's fondness for rebuilding old trucks. As the hours passed, the weight of the previous night seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet optimism. Later, as Rachel prepared to leave, she turned to Terence on the porch. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're going to make a difference here. Whether it's with veterans or just showing people like Hank that there's a better way to be." "Thanks, Rachel," Terence said, his voice warm. "And thanks for not letting me face last night alone." She smiled, her cheeks reddening slightly. "Anytime." As she drove away, Terence stood on the porch for a while, watching the horizon. The town was waking up, the promise of a new day spreading across the landscape. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, not just for himself, but for the people around him. Inside, his phone buzzed with a message from Bill. It was short and to the point. "Thanks again for hearing me out. You're a good man, Terence. Hope to see you around." Terence smiled faintly as he typed a reply. "We all have room to grow. Take care, Bill." He set the phone down and stepped outside, the warmth of the sun on his face. The battles he faced now were different from the ones he'd fought overseas, but they were no less important. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. As the morning unfolded, Terence got to work, not just on the old truck in his driveway, but on the new chapter of his life, one rooted in resilience, understanding, and the quiet strength that came from choosing the harder path, the one of peace.